Good evening. Welcome everybody to our fourth meeting of the online series, Scientiae series, History of Scholarship and the Global Imagination. We are coordinating this series together with Stefano Gulizia and in cooperation with the Institute of Philosophy, Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague. This week I'm chairing from Prague. Next week, Stefano will be chairing from Turin or the US? No, Turin already. Okay. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Ewa Zakrzewska, who is a PhD researcher at the Department of History of the European University Institute in Florence. Ewa focuses on the early modern history of science, and her dissertation deals with information architecture of academic repositories in the long 17th century, including archives, museums, or such phenomena as embodied encyclopedias and methodical machines. Before the beginning of her PhD studies, Ewa had graduated from the Warburg Institute in London, where she was a Peltz Scholar with an MA degree in Cultural, Intellectual, and Visual History, and from the University of Warsaw with a degree in Philosophy. I should also mention that this year, Ewa serves as the co-convener of the History of Science and Medicine Working Group at the European University Institute in Florence. So welcome, Ewa. The title of Ewa's today's talk is Desiderata or Experimental Wish List, a case study in information architecture and principles of collaborative inquiry in the early Royal Society. And we are very much looking forward to hear your presentation and to see your presentation indeed. So Ewa, floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Vladimir, for your generous introduction. Thank you, Stefano and Vladimir, for bringing us together as an academic community in this series of seminars. And I'm very happy to see you all today. What I would like to do in my talk today is to read, perhaps against the grain, a very interesting source that is buried deep, not so much more, I think, but still it's not an obvious source. In the archives of the Royal Society Library in London, experimental wish lists addressed to several fellows. But before I start, I would like to provide some foundations, as it were, and I think that the word is a little bit of an important one because of its architectural connotations. About my perspective, questions and queries, which I would like to inquire of this source together with you. So Vladimir already mentioned that excuse me, can you see my slides changing?
Not yet.
I'm trying to change my slides. My apologies for this technical disruption. I'm trying to.
For now, it doesn't change.
Please give me, right. Please give me a moment. Yes, I'll try this one more time. So. Okay. All right, great. It's always funny to deal with technical disruptions where you are talking about the history of science and information. But then Vladimír has already mentioned that my PhD project deals with information architecture of repositories of academic societies or scientific societies in the period between 1600 and 1750. And perhaps many of you are wondering right now, what do I mean by information architecture? Let us see this quote from Robert Hooke, who says that the intellect should, like a skillful architect, understand what it designs to do, and then consider what things are requisite to be provided in order to this design, to collect the materials and lay them up in an order convenient so nothing may be far to seek or hard to come by. What is not obvious from this quote, however, is the context in which Hooke poses it, and he poses it in an... Excuse me?
Aha, dobře.
Sorry, there's somebody talking apart from me, so right. Sorry, I believe that it was just like a momentary disruption. So what is not obvious from this quote is the context in which Hooke poses it. And he poses it in a kind of attempt to develop a method or engine for philosophical investigations in a collective of academics. A method or engine which is both philosophical and material for developing observations and reasonings. And he lays out prerequisites for this. So from a contemporary perspective, we may well say that what Hooke is after seems to be, sorry, the slides again. I'm trying to I'm trying to change the slides, but it's not coming along. Yes. So so today perhaps you would say that what Hooke is after in this quote is perhaps a database. So a structured collection of data capable of being sorted for a purpose of knowledge production, as David Sepkowski defines it in a recent Information, a Historical Companion. Sepkowski also highlights that databases are vital in permitting the recontextualization of information derived from multiple sources. And what information architecture is, a term which is perhaps more familiar to IT specialists than to historians of science and knowledge so far, is, I believe, the structural and performative organizational dimensions of databases. So the search after categories in which to fit all those data, bits of information, building blocks from which larger arguments or bodies of evidence can be built, and then allowing them to not be just static collections, but rather mobile elements which help to develop new observations and conclusions. And just as Sepkowski, who argues for some kind of deliberate anachronism in pursuing the management of historical information across the centuries, I also believe that this is a kind of a challenge, creating information architectures to which every period responds in its own way. And I think that just trying to see how these developments came along in a period which brought together academic societies, scientific societies, collectives eager to investigate the orders of nature, collectives who are trying to find a shared common language of categories to develop those investigations, and who are trying to find some reasoning aids from material sources. I think this is this is exactly what I'm interested in, both in my general topic and both in the topic which I will be presenting to you today. So I pose two general research questions to the whole body of my sources, not just the Royal Society archive. First of all, the question which I term embodied encyclopedias. I'm asking, how did repositories of academic societies perform as materialized orders of preference and classifications in the age of philosophical controversies? And my other questions, the one about methodical machines, is about how did repositories mimic assumptions about philosophical and scientific method in serving as observation and ratiocination aids? And my more specific questions during the archival research at the Royal Society Library in London, where I first became acquainted with those sources, is what is the design and practice of record keeping and information sourcing in an early institutional scientific archive? And then, how did the Royal Society's shared information environment allow for operative and flexible categorization? Because I think many of us are familiar with Thomas Pratt's dictum about gathering a mixed mass of experiments, not yielding to schemes of theories and opinions. But then I think that people still need some kind of orders to be able to work with their sources. So the question is how to somehow reconcile those opposites. How did this shared information environment allow for collective investigation practice? And whether there was any methodical agenda to be implemented in terms of information sourcing. And with these questions, I approach a very fascinating source, a collection of desiderata or wish lists, which are present in the Royal Society Library's domestic manuscripts, to be precise, volume 5 of those manuscripts. These manuscripts cover items that are mostly of administrative importance, but also the volume 5, which houses 17th and 18th century objects, has several sources about the developments of philosophical and scientific proposals to the society. And among them, wish lists, termed on one page, experiments recommended to several persons. It's a collection of 33 lists items addressed to 29 fellows, because some are duplicates. On the recto, as you can see, you have the title and the name of the addressee. You have a list of inquiries that the addressee is asked to pursue, whether this is asking after information of some sort or performing experiments. The lists are varied in length. Sometimes, usually it's 3 or 4 items, sometimes just 1 item, sometimes a whole long list. But what unites them is that you can turn them around to review on the verso the name of the addressee and to witness that they seem to have been folded. So perhaps they have been distributed to fellows at some point to aid them in their inquiries. And I think this is very interesting that the wish lists so far have not merited a long and contextual study the way another group of sources from the domestic manuscripts did. Michael Hunter has provided a study of the minutes of different subject committees of the Royal Society, which are literally neighboring with those wish lists of desiderata, and trying to transcribe them and understand their meaning, but didn't speak of the wish list in connection to them. Vera Keller also studied those wish lists in connection to a broader argument of her book about knowledge and the public interest in 2015, namely that epistemic and public social interests were closely intertwined in the 17th century, and those wish lists perhaps were a way to institutionalize demands for improving upon society and science at large. My perspective is different insofar I'm interested in what makes up those wish lists in terms of building blocks of information architecture. What kinds of categories are developed in those requests? What kind of program for gathering information is at play there? As well as how could those lists testify to the circulation of information in an early scientific archive? What is their function in the repository at large? So keeping these questions in mind, I would like to introduce you first to a question, what the wish lists aren't, and then what the wish lists are. So to start with what they are not. When I approached them for the first time, I assumed that they perhaps will follow some kind of presuppositions that Bacon formulated for gathering of information. And indeed, one of the minutes of the committee that I have mentioned, bordering on the collection of wish lists, mentions some kind of program for collecting the phenomena of nature, which closely mirrors what Bacon proposed in his well-known treatise Parasceve ad Historiam Naturalem. So there is a proposition to gather a committee which will somehow process philosophical experiments into observations of generations, so natural occurrences, preter-generations, unnatural occurrences, and arts, so human sciences and crafts. And furthermore, in this in the minutes of the committee, we read it's almost repeating word for word what Bacon said, that history of preter-generations is to be joined with generations as kind of mirror images about how phenomena develop in natural and unnatural ways. And then it also mirrors the order of heads for natural history that Bacon proposed in the appendix to Parasceve. So celestial bodies, followed by errant meteors, followed by earth and sea, followed by elements, and then particular bodies or lesser species. So far, so good. But then when we inspect the actual wish lists, we sometimes see Baconian sounding items like history of something, in this case of paper making. But then the lists are very miscellaneous. On the list of Abraham Hill, for instance, which is pictured there, we can see items such as inspecting tenacity of bodies, consulting of authors about aquasalientes, different experiments with water. So some of the items are collected, but not all. And this is typical of the lists. They are highly miscellaneous and they do not seem subjuncted to any methodical agenda of the Bacon type. They are not, it's not explained how they are supposed to be linked to pursuing some head of natural history or generations, preter-generations, whatever. So how to explain this? I think the explanations there are two different explanations to this. One is Michael Hunter's and other is Vera Keller's. So Hunter says that thematical committees were destined to a quick failure because fellows had different interests. They did not follow the committees which they were initially subscribed to. They pursued different experiments on their own. So that's why perhaps it could be applied to explain why the wish lists do not follow a unified agenda and why they do not seem connected to committees, for instance, for agriculture or mechanics and optics or history of trades as such. So that would mirror the different interests of fellows. Vera Keller also supplies an explanation to why the wish list could look that way, connecting them to some entry in journal book original, so the minutes of the society's general meetings apart from committees. She found a source of a plea to collate lists of experiments to make fellows follow up on their experimental obligations that they subscribe to in several meetings. So this is a kind of a memory supplying list. That's why sometimes the items not in this list, but generally have day dates written next to them. And that's why they do not seem connected to the committee projects. So far, so good. But there's also a thing which I think demands further explanation, which is why the wish lists usually function as they are known to under the term Desiderata. This is how they are catalogued in the Royal Society Archive catalog at large. And they sometimes have titles such as Desiderata attached to this. But also other types of items present in the Royal Society Archive feature under the title of Desiderata and seem very different, in my opinion, to those lists. On the left of the screen, you can see a very famous item from the Royal Society collections, stemming from Robert Boyle papers. I think this is really a celebrity item among the Royal Society collections because it lists things that we all, I believe, long after in some way, regardless of the historical period, such as the prolongation of life, the recovery of youth or visible signs of it, the art of flying, continuing underwater, or the cure of wounds or diseases at a distance. But the items which are supposed, according to Virakella's argument, to be desires to improve not just knowledge, but the conditions of the society at large, do not come with any recipes as to how to achieve them. They seem very indeterminate wishes for the distant future. Whereas on wish lists that I have in mind, the ones from domestic manuscripts, which are also classified as desiderata, you have several items which come with very specific instructions how to do them. So, for instance, to try whether pebble stones enclosed in glasses with water will grow, to do it in several waters and with a gauge, to inquire of the keeper of the eel boat the differences of eels, or to examine several waters in and about London. Sometimes they specify how to do this, sometimes not, but this is definitely something to be achieved with the means we have now. It follows the logic of a to-do list rather than an optative wish list, I think. So I believe that we should look really closer into what kinds of items and categories make up those lists. So to proceed to the part of my talk where I'm trying to establish what the wish lists are rather than what they aren't. So oftentimes, as you can see in the title of this slide, Desiderata as a title is crossed out and replaced with experiments. And indeed, most of the items on the lists are experiments of different sorts. But they come in different shapes, and I believe that it's necessary to establish a typology of what those experiments are. So you have several types of the length and specificity of what comes under the title of an experiment, such as title length descriptions. So just, for instance, the experiment of lifting up bellows underwater. This is nota bene repeated across several lists, which hints at the fact that it perhaps was to be tested concurrently. So that's just the very general descriptions of the type of experiment. However, what comes as a most frequent category is a short description of the experimental task. So try X in Y conditions, usually. So to try whether pebble stones enclosed in glasses with water will grow, for instance. And sometimes it comes paired with an inquiry to be tested. So for instance, perhaps the addition of a gauge will help us, will change the conditions of the experiment to a certain extent. So this is a question, so a query specifying conditions. And sometimes, this is a very rare type, but happening nevertheless, we are faced with a complete narrative recipe. So for instance, detailing this step by step in a list of experiments proposed to William Neal, we have an instruction to take a long tube, fill it at the bottom with salt water, then place a little vessel of fresh water in the middle of the tube, close the top so the fire might not get out, etc. So we have a whole set of sequence, what is to be done to achieve a certain result or to test a certain query. So you see how different and how differently detailed the experiments are. And what I would like to argue for is this type of fashioning building blocks of inquiries is very similar to a different genre present in the Royal Society archives, namely that of query or question lists. In the collection of classified papers, each volume of classified papers corresponds to a different subject or topic. There is a separate classified paper volume, which is volume 19, which is dedicated to questions and answers. And it usually features lists of questions to travelers to certain lands or geographical areas, such as the one that I'm quoting that appears on the screen on the left. So this is an inquiry by Mr. Colwell to be copied, so perhaps being distributed in a way very similar to that of the wish lists, where several questions are listed to be watched for, so kinds of, they direct what are you supposed to be searching for. And they are very focused, of course. Desiderata, mostly the wish lists from domestic manuscripts, are not as focused and feature very different inquiries. But I think they follow a very similar logic of what is to be inspected, what is to be regarded in several processes, what is to be done. For instance, to boil flesh in snow water to see whether it will look whiter and eat more tender. So I think it follows the same kind of logic of asking questions, of guarding inquiries. And it's certainly, I believe that the Desiderata are certainly much more similar to query lists in that respect than for the traditional Desiderata, such as Boyle's wish list. And then I think there is an interesting similarity to be observed here in terms that sometimes the recipe query lists can serve as core protocols for observation, which sometimes make their way into the questions and answers volume that I was just quoting from. For instance, in the mentioned questions and answer volume, we find directions for observing the conjunction of Mercury with the Sun by Robert Morey, which does not name a specific addressee. It's just a general instructions as to how to observe and what to observe, and a step-by-step guide to performing these observations of conjunctions of Mercury with the Sun, starting from consulting authors to processing questions from those authors to modifying one's own observation based on what the authors got wrong, and so forth. So this is a kind of a recipe for observation. And I think the very same thing happens in recipe-like items from the Desiderata lists, like this one proposed to William Neal. We have a query. So whether the cuttingness of drink kept in bottles does not proceed from the beating of the particles, etc. And then there are testing conditions or protocol for observation. So if a bottle were lined with some soft matter, perhaps you wouldn't achieve this result. So this is a kind of a suggestion what to modify in one's observations, what to look after. And I think that it's interesting also in a different aspect to this kind of similarity, because when we observe how these items look like as physical items, rather than just texts, they have the very similar formats. For instance, Robert Morey's directions take the shape of a very small paper sheet of several, like it's a kind of a folded paper sheet where he lists those steps. And experiments proposed to William Neal is a very different in size and format sheet. And I believe that they were both supposed to be taken whether into a field or into a laboratory and perhaps consulted those queries and instructions as people minding about those observations or experiments went along. So I believe it's worthy to keep this in mind. When we read the sources further, we see that what's not obvious is what the intended audience of the items from the wish lists would be. We have formulations of the type that we see on the left. An experiment recommended to Sir Robert Morey reads that he is required to compare the effects of heat and cold in rarefaction and condensation of air with that of force or weight. It's very unspecific. It specifies what is to be done generally, but perhaps there's a kind of a tacit knowledge involved, what equipment to use or how to go about the experiment, which the request does not detail. Whereas an experiment such as this proposed to William Neal details very much step by step, very closely what equipment is to be used, how to go about the operation, what to do. It's much more specific. So I think there may be both proficient audiences and beginners audiences addressed in different wish lists. I think in this very specific case, the difference in formulation of those requests stems from the fact that Morey was much older and more experienced than Neal was when they received their wish lists. But never mind, we should, I think, wonder what kind of audience are those experiments addressed to. And something that I'm most curious about when considering this source is who is expected to provide explanations for the performed experiments. Because earlier in the domestic manuscripts volume, we find a document called Proposals Humbly Offered for Better Consideration, which Hunter dates back to the late 1660s. So the document proposes something which usually proposals for reforming the Royal Society proposed as a kind of a solution to most of the society's problems, namely to establish a committee. And this specific committee would be invested in bringing in possible cause or causes of the experiment. So kind of jointly debating the theory behind why phenomena happen in certain ways. And it argues that it's not the sole purpose of the society just to make experiments, but also the fellows should judge those experiments. And as the author nicely puts it, they should afford the world the benefit of their fancy and invention, not just manual industry. The other proposal for reforming the Royal Society mentioned that some fellows treat the society just as a means to go in weekly and amuse themselves for an hour or so with experiments. So this is perhaps some sort of admonition to this fact. But nevertheless, what's most interesting about this document is the way that it specifies that the main business of making experiments that the society subscribes to will not be impeded because causes of things, so the theory, will be relegated to committees, not to the society in general. And I think that the picture that emerges from this document is a kind of a vision of the Royal Society where fellows do experiments, committees, perhaps divided along Baconian lines of different hands of natural history, debate the theory behind what is behind the results, and there's some kind of division of work in action. But then some of the requests in wish lists also feature a kind of request for causes. For instance, there is a request that mentions that to make a trial whether the salt imbibed by the fire be not the chief cause of cold. And I think that we have to ask ourselves to what extent were fellows responsible for providing explanations as well as results. We can list, by this I mean several interconnected things. So first of all, if we perhaps somehow artificially oppose experimental research as performing some actions and to theoretical explanations, so the pursuit of causes, I wonder whether in this case that would happen on a collective or individual level. So would it be the task of the society as an institution to provide explanations, perhaps divided into those thematic lines, like the failed committees of the early 1660s? Or would it be also the task of the fellows? And in discussing this, I think that the line between the speculative and the experimental is indeed very thin, because we have witnessed previously how the items on the wish lists often come with a query to be tested or a hypothesis or something like this. So it's also a plea to observe and test a certain claim and not just perform the experiment. So I think we should ask ourselves what would be the role of the Royal Society as an institution, as an academic body then. And also, I think what's the question that lurks behind this kind of query is, what do we mean by causes? So perhaps in contemporary philosophy of science, we are trained to think of causes as theoretical explanations, as for instance, general laws or something. But also perhaps we may think of causes not in this strong sense, but also as a kind of inference of some kind of correlation between phenomena happening, as perhaps in the instance of the cause asked for in the experiment proposed to William Nail. I don't know whether this is asking after cause in a strong sense, so like for instance a low sense. So I just wonder how fine-grained the causes in explanations of the society would be. And the reason for asking these questions is evidence from another types of sources that come from roughly the same period, So, for instance, Locke, in his essay concerning human understanding, mentions the situation where very learned and ingenious physicians, so some kind of academic body, meets. They discuss the question whether any liquor passes through the filaments of the nerves, and they can't come to a single conclusion. They just dispute, but nothing comes out of this. And then Locke steps in and proposes to discuss what do they mean by the liquor, the very word. And then they find out that they meant very different things by the term liquor. They had different ideas about this. And even if we concede that in case of that Locke's anecdote serves the means of providing some kind of argument for his epistemological theory about us not having access to real essences, so like the molecular level of things, but only operating by ideas when we deal with the natural phenomena, I think there is still some kind of problem in academic societies of the time. Otherwise, we wouldn't be faced with sources such as this entry from Chambers' Cyclopedia, published in the early 18th century, where he proceeds to list opinions of different philosophical schools about fluids. So, for instance, he, of course, provides a general explanations that these are bodies whose particles are weakly connected. But then he goes on to define what Newtonians and Cartesians mean by this. And of course, one of these opinions emerged after the wish lists were distributed. So it does not immediately apply to the wish list of the 1660s. But still, in this half century that follows the emergence of the wish lists, many philosophical opinions come to light and disputes are going on. And I just wonder what would be the role of academic bodies in providing theoretical explanations of phenomena, given those differing opinions about things as fundamental as that, what a fluid is, or what's the explanation behind fluidity, or this. We can see this subtle philosophical judging by Chambers that defining a thing from a property which is disputable is certainly bad philosophy. He takes sides for Newtonians, but still we can see that scientific concord is a very interesting phenomena which should be inquired further and which the wish list somehow bring to light. So that's a kind of an intellectual historical exposition of the phenomena that the wish lists as categories in development are. And to conclude my talk, I would like to point attention to their materiality, and ask how could they perhaps serve as material observation aids? How could they be part of the repository? And what should we make of them as items in history of science? So you have already seen perhaps on previous slides that they appear to have been folded. They have addresses on the back, so they seem to have been distributed. Maybe those were just occasional records that were supposed to go out of the Royal Society and not really expected to come back. But then there are duplicates in the collection. They are all very clean copies, and we inspect things such as here on the back of a duplicate of requests connected to the Lord of Argyll, there is an annotation about experiments recommended to several persons. And then it's identical to a title appearing on one slip on a page about eight pages earlier. So, and it's 17th century hand. It's the same quality of paper. So I wonder whether there could have been an effort to preserve them somehow, to make copies for the archive and to retain them as some source of prompts to understand what kind of observations were going on. This is just a conjecture. It's difficult to test their circulation mode, but that's what I think. And if this conjecture about them being parts of the archive would be true, I think this is interesting insofar that these items could be part of a repository taken in a different sense, meaning a collective research instrument. I have begun this talk with quoting Robert Hooke's general scheme, and I would like to end with him. Because Hooke towards the end of this treatise, which appeared posthumously, proposes to develop a kind of collective comparative investigation instrument, which is very simple but yet very effective. So he proposes to have a large book bound like those for keeping prints and pictures and drawings, and to stick on the sides small with soluble glue so that it's allowed to move around. So small schedules, so small pieces of paper which contain abbreviated and complicated, so perhaps expanded histories of observations and experiments. So we have a large book, we have small items in paper where you write the results, the observations, the deductions, the hypotheses. Hook lists several conceptual items, what's to be written there. It's kind of this is a kind of a listing what is to be observed. So the key thing about this repository is the fact that the format of those little paper slips allows them to be moved around, and so to investigate possible different outcomes and hypotheses about phenomena. This is a kind of embodied thinking procedure, I think, testing conjectures with your eyes and hands in company of fellow academics. And you can place queries on the site, as he writes, to keep track of what are you really investigating in a moment, what's the method of a query behind this, you can develop this in different orders. And he also reserves a special place for the queries. So the thing that as I tried to show appear as a basic item in the wish lists. So Hook says that they should be written in a book other than the album for prints or a single sheet of paper, and that they should be exposed to the view of the schedules in this main repository. So perhaps those paper slips could have been preserved in the archive to serve as prompts for understanding the results and outcomes and hypothetical speculations about what the results of the experiments, if they were performed, could mean. And I have to say that this is a conjecture. I'm just trying to understand their role in the archive. It's, I think, the most hypothetical part of my work so far, but I'm just very curious about just why could it have been preserved and how it could work as observation and ratiocination prompts. And to end my talk, I would like to leave you with the following conclusions and questions. We're in a state of suspense right now because I can't. Just a little bit of patience. I hope to change this. Okay, so here are my conclusions and further questions. So first of all, which comes contrary to what I expected when I have first ventured in this archive, the wish lists do not seem to mirror any predetermined methodical agenda or a philosophical program for gathering information. The Baconian ethos, of course, is very broad, and we can say that in a long run, it could perhaps contribute to developing those natural histories that Bacon was after. but then categories of Paraskevae are not once mentioned as what is to be looked after, what is to be demanded from the fellows. And I think that even though they are not classified, they are classified as desiderata in the Royal Society archive, they are not really desiderata in the sense of tentative wishes for knowledge or social advancement, and instead follow a kind of a to-do list logic. And then what they are interesting, I think, because they are witness to negotiating the very category of an experiment. I think that as an epistemic genre, it seems very closely related to that of the query list, the lists of questions and answers that the society sent otherwise. And occasionally, where we have to do with where we witness those recipe-like experiments, they fulfill the role of a core protocol for how to conduct observations. And that's something that I would argue for. But then there are questions which I'm not so sure about how to answer at this point, but I found fascinating nevertheless. So first of all, what would be the role of the institutions, such as a scientific society, in collaborative explanation of phenomena? So would an academic body, perhaps a committee for bringing in causes of the kind that the document that I showcased before speculated, would such a committee be of concord, or rather, as evidence from Lockhart Chambers suggests, would fellows voice preferences of distinct natural philosophical schools and not agree on foundational terms? And then I'm still wondering about how we should treat the category of cause here, because the items on the wish list provide queries and hypotheses to be tested. The theory and practice dividing line seems thin, and I think it seems that the fellows are supposed to provide explanations as well. The thing to be established is how strong those explanations are supposed to be. So should they be linked to establishing laws or natural philosophical explanations? So how finely grained they should be really? Whether it's just saying that there's an inferential correlation of some phenomena, or is it an attempt to provide a reason behind it in a broad sense? So what is requested, just observational results or explanation in a stronger sense? And then I have tried to show you that these items are interested not just in an intellectual historical capacity, but also as material items belonging to a repository. So we have some evidence to understand how they were supposed to be used and circulated. We can glimpse their material condition, but then we still are left with questions about what was their intended preservation and use. And I think the most interesting use, if we could argue for that, would be that of Hooke's suggested method for comparative collections. So this kind of developing different, like literally making a puzzle out of building blocks of information and trying to understand correlations between phenomena in this way. And I would like to, that would be an interesting explanation, I believe, why those are clean copies, perhaps preserved for an archive. Why would they be retained and how could they function? But still, I think it's still a matter to be further investigated. And I'm just very curious what your opinions would be on this. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ewa. Thank you for this wonderful and very rich paper. Can you please stop sharing your presentation
I will.
now? Okay,
Okay.
perfect. Okay, thank you for mapping for us these various epistemic genres like desiderata, wish lists, the query lists, protocols for observation, and directions for observation. You've also discussed the intended audiences of this material and materiality of the wish lists. And you posed more general questions like the relationship between the practice of experiments and the formulated theories, and who was allowed, let's say, to provide explanations in the institutional setting. So I would like to open the discussion right now, and I see Professor Iorizzo, please.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Oh, great. So thank you for your wonderful talk. So I think you and I are probably the only ones besides Michael Hunter and Vera Keller who've gone through all of the domestic manuscripts and classified papers, at least in this century. So I wanted to. I'm familiar with all of the cases that you're talking about. So I just wanted to go to your conclusions, if that's okay, and to just say something about your conclusions and give some comments about the methodology, about how to think about the Baconian references. So I think you're right that there's a general adoption of the catalog of particular histories from the Paraskive that's clearly documented by Keller and Hunter, but also you'll find that in the Great Instauration, he mentions on page, I think, 223 that in a general way, the Royal Society is working against a kind of catalog of particular history. So that's established. That's not really controversial. But I think what's happened in the last 10 years with the Oxford Francis Bacon project is that we've begun to appreciate more how Bacon's catalog of particular histories is expanded in the Silva Silvarum. And so what I've noticed is that the miscellaneous particular natural histories that you find, or experimental natural histories that you find in the Royal Society don't just come from the Paraskive or the catalog of particular histories, but many of them come from the Silva Silvarum. In fact, the language of, take a test tube or dig a pit, these are familiar instructions in the Silva Silvarum. And if you look at the margins of the Silva Silvarum, you'll see that Bacon writes always experimental history of. So clearly the Silva Silvarum is an expansion of the catalog of particular histories from 1620 to 23. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that people forget to leave out the experimental in the title of the Paraskive, and it's experimental natural history. So it's good that you've made that clear, that we're talking about experiments, and as Cesare Pastorino in his recent article on recipes shows that, and also Gianni Primata, that this idea of experiment is a new and emerging epistemic genre. So that's all very much in concert with what's research that's going on right now. When you ask about whether or not it's an individual or a institutional job to settle ideas about causes, it would absolutely have to be the case that it was individual, not institutional, as Michael Hunter rightly argues in his establishing the Royal Society. There was so much division about whether you were Newtonian or a Cartesian or vitalist or corpuscular philosopher, that it would be really impossible to come up with an institutional theory. And in fact, it would be anti-Baconian, as Donna Jalubiano recognizes that Bacon is a non-systematizer. So he doesn't want there to be just one theory that an institution gets behind, but the whole project of the progress of knowledge, or of natural knowledge, has to do with theories combating one another. And I really love your focusing on the idea of what a cause is, because that's very crucial, because that gets to the point of there is no institutional idea of what a cause is, and so your comparison with Locke and others is absolutely fantastic. Whether it's, I think your last point about individual versus collective explanations, I think that there are clearly clusters of people who think are pushing the same theory, and then clusters of people who are pushing a different theory. So I think it's more, just as we have in contemporary academia, different sides clustering around different questions. And so it's very much mirroring, what has happened from the pre-Socratics. When we talk about the pre-Socratics, it's not one thing. They're the Ionian pre-Socratics and the non-Ionian pre-Socratics. So I think that that's an easy thing to answer in your conclusions. I hope I've not spoken out of turn.
Thank you very much for this rich feedback. I have to say that really I think this is a kind of a fundamental question, the ones about providing explanations, because that's why I think this is interesting. Why do we have academic societies in this period, regardless of individual differences and circumstances and philosophical schools? Why do we have societies such as, for instance, maybe not the Royal, but the French Academies of the Sciences, which, for instance, mentioned that given our individual differences, the discourse should be profitable and pleasurable, and should follow also some, like societal expectations, not for people to tend to kindly disagree rather than openly disagree. This is a kind of, I have to say that I'm at the very beginning of this research. It's my very first archival case study, and I still have to investigate collective elaboration of causes further, so to inspect this problem further. But I'm very grateful for your pointing out the Silva Silvarum element. And I have to say that maybe the thing that I need to do in more detail is whether those experiments really are, like the proposed experiments, are really from the Silva Silvarum, because some items repeat across the lists. It seems like it's desired that different fellows bring different responses or observations to the fact. And it's also typical for questions and query lists which are sent out, for instance, to different parts of England or different countries to collect answers. There are items not in the Royal Society archive, but in other archives, such as Bodleian Library, where you see the same print sheets with the same questions, but filled below by different kinds of scripts with different answers. So I think what's interesting there is developing of ways to provide different opinions and to bring together different observations, and this tension between how open should this experimental program be. I have to say that I had a privilege of participating in a very interesting and formative summer school this year with Dana Jalobeanu and Dan Garber and Sophie Hu and many other wonderful people. And we debated the very thing, what is a controversy and collaboration in the scientific revolution? And then we asked ourselves whether we can speak of things such as the scientific program, whether we can speak that a scientific program exists given the fact that experiments, such as experiments with the vacuum, seem to circulate throughout Europe, are translated, are printed in different contexts. You can see that people share experiments, these protocols for observations with one another. But then they try to share the know-how behind this. So for instance, equipment list and other things, but they have very different questions and approaches. The same experiments can be done by proponents of the vacuum, opponents of the vacuum, etc. And I think we are very much influenced by contemporary philosophy of science in thinking of a scientific program as something which, has a common theoretical core, which we protect, as in Imre Lakatos' solution of the matter. And then we can modify details, but we have to stick to the theoretical core. So maybe we are just projecting scientific philosophical 20th century scientific philosophical explanations onto the 17th century, but it's absolutely fascinating. And I think this is something that really merits an answer: to what extent those theoretical assumptions are shared and how our programs and collaborations develop nevertheless. Thank you very much for all the references which I have noted and for your great points.
Well, I would be happy to write a paper with you on this, and so I will email you privately and share my own research, so that my research doesn't have to be duplicated.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ewa. And by the way, I've been working with Dan Garber and Donna and the Bucharest Bacon Mafia for a long time. So anyway, you couldn't have had a better summer school.
I agree.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments to this wonderful paper? Yes, please, Landert.
Thank you, Ewa, for the wonderful paper. I really liked your explanation in the material aspects of these Wislids, with Robert Hooke's explanation of the glue and just talking about the size of these pieces of paper and where they might have taken these papers with them. And I had to think about Robert Plutt's work on the natural history of Oxfordshire around the same time. And he made small printed sheets of queries. So this is more in the genre of the query, the questionnaire. But he has these questions that he wants to ask to each different people in different parts of England, as you already said. And I was wondering about the relationship print versus manuscript cultures. So when is print useful for these early modern academies, and when do they choose to stick with pen and paper, as it were? And yeah, have you come any examples of the wish list to be printed or not? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leander. This is a brilliant question, and I have to say you have highlighted a really really important thing about this. In terms of wish lists from the Royal Society Archive themselves, I saw pen of paper definitely prevail over print, but in terms of different archives, I saw printed sheets prevail rather. And I think maybe one really obvious answer to this, but I think off the top of my head, that print would be useful if you had to circulate this through larger distances, for instance. So, or whether you would have to, or like I've mentioned those sheets of queries which have this like broad blank space under them. I think also developed by Plotbat for Wales, which are collected in one of the Ashmore manuscripts in the Bodleian Library, and they have like they come back with different scripts, different hands under the question or query, which is the same. So I think they are good instruments for spreading your net very wide. I think in the case of wishlists by fellows, most of them would be stationed quite near, and perhaps this would be connected to their meetings, to the minutes of their meetings. So perhaps there would be no need to distribute this on a wide scale. So I think it has very much to do, it has lots to do with these matters of distributions and whether you are supposed to receive an answer to those queries or results of an experiment orally in a meeting or in a paper, or are you supposed to just like receive a written reply to this in a different way. But this is a crucial aspect, and thank you so much for pointing this out.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jonathan Barry.
Thank you very much for your paper. I've just actually been editing a volume of letters between a president of the Royal Society, Sir Robert Southwell, and a customs officer in Bristol, who he was always getting to do experiments for him. So it was very lively thought. I wanted to take you back to Hooke. Of course, it's very appropriate that Hooke should write about architecture, given that he was also an architect, in the sense that he designed a large number of buildings, at least. But he was also the curator of experiments, was he not, for the Royal Society? And I've always been interested in that term, curator, and obviously it's interesting in the context of an archive that you're talking about. And your talk made me think very much about Hooke as a collector of information and a store of that information, whereas, of course, we're brought up to think of him as a man actually conducting experiments. And I was wondering, I mean, do you think that Hooke is actually the writer of these requests to people? I mean, you didn't speculate at all about who was actually generating these queries. So could this be Hooke, in fact, or is that maybe that's a bit of a naive biographical question when you're trying to focus on, as it were, the structures of these things? But given that, as everybody else has said, the Royal Society, in a sense, is such a personal organization, or made up of so many individuals with different agendas. I mean, are these a reflection of Hooke's own personal agenda? And as I say, what did he see himself as a curator of experiments?
There is, I have to say, like, in terms of whether he wrote this personally or conceived of this personally in terms of devising what should be done where, I think that I wouldn't argue that it was Hooke himself who was the mastermind behind all those little wish lists, but rather perhaps I think that Ira Keller's explanation about them originating in meetings and meetings minutes, and then like being kind of follow-ups on what a fellow is supposed to do is, I think, the most probable explanation of why did the wish lists come about and what did they do. I think Hooke could have a hand in trying to develop a program for experiments themselves, or perhaps in discussing those. But in terms of who made those requests, I think that those were, like, literally, if you mean like the material items and writing them up, it would have been there were the scribes, the minutes of the committees mentions that a scribe was asked to collate a list for experiments for this and that from what was discussed or something. So I think this explains the origins of this, but this is a great point. But actually, Hooke perhaps was interested in those, like, you know, with all these architectural mentions and the building blocks and trying to develop reasoning because of his like that both, you know, like architectural and curatorial activities going hand in hand. But also I have to add like that it's very difficult to trace the origins and afterlives of the experiment. They are sometimes written so enigmatically that you can't really understand what are they really pointing towards, what did they originate with, and where, for instance, I was trying to match them with results from the record book's original to see whether they were really followed up to. And sometimes you can't really specify the order, the origins, the causal relations between what happens in reports and minutes of the society and the lists themselves. Because you have an item called a bird embalmed after some way in a list of Charlton. You see that Charlton had indeed at the same date given a recipe for a powder to conserve birds, but the formulation is such that you can specify whether the recipe was brought about by this desideratum being sent to him, or whether the desideratum was a kind of a follow-up on what he proposed to the society. It's very difficult to just like establish the order and causal references to this. But I have to think deeper about Hooke as a mastermind behind those experiments. So thank you for the point.
Thank you very much. Stefano?
Hi. So it's lovely to see you, Eva, as always. And I think you just using the word archival afterlife is really crucial because I think this is a point of how to evaluate. This was one of my two questions. How do we evaluate the antiquarian value of these papers? Because in some cases, given that they're so individual, it actually makes it difficult to assess that. Because if you think of a famous example like the Samuel Hartlib archive, there you have a personal filing system that collapses and they no longer understand who is the owner, right? You have guests to come and leave various scribal traces onto it. And so in your cases, everything is so clean, everything is so that actually is difficult to evaluate, to assess the use value of these pieces, the aftermath, the afterlife of these pieces. And so this will be the question, just, I mean, one question, how to evaluate the antiquarian value. When do the wish list came to possess an antiquarian value as items, as collecting items? The other question is, because the series is interested in ignorance, we are interested in forms of non-knowledge. Be them suppression or be them just articulation, really, of things that we do not know. And I'm struck by how you presented to us the way in which the wish list abbreviates the experimental process. And so in this abbreviation, how do we conceptualize what is lost? Whether it's contingency, I mean, there are aspects related to a specific day, a specific occurrence, something theoretically that fails, or just informants like enslaved African labor or silkworm in Virginia. I'm thinking about those sort of faraway cases, just to think about what is the articulation of knowledge and non-knowledge in the wish list as a genre. So that's the second question. Thank you, Eva.
Thank you for these wonderful questions. So first of all, given the archive, the antiquarian value and other things, this is what puzzled me as well and what I tried to pay attention to in the last part of my talk, the one about materiality of those items, because they are very clean. There are no annotations of this. There are sometimes those like Desiderata crossed up with experiments, but then you have, but it seems as if they were curated, like when like when you open this volume in the archive as a 21st century researcher, you treat them as kind of like archival items with value, and perhaps at the time those were like little messages to be sent out, some kind of like like today perhaps those would be some like to do emails or correspondence in a working project, something we do not really think of as to worship really as archival sources. So that's why my kind of hypothesis about using them as part of a working repository, or just like keeping, like preserving a kind of a memory, what is done actually, what kinds of experiments and queries were we after in something. I think that maybe that's why there seem to be archival copies, and that's why perhaps they weren't discarded absolutely as kind of, paper rubbish to be done away with when they are sent out. I can't, like this, I'm still intrigued by this, like by this apparently the 17th century hand, which writes those experiments recommended to several persons into places, which seems that could have been curated and that there are duplicates of those items. So I think that there might have been value in the 17th century, in this as a kind of a reminder of the program. What have we done in this capacity? What kinds of experiments have we done? Or maybe even thinking of this, like administratively, saying that like you can hold up a fellow to whether he performed something for the society or not really. But I think the very emergence of domestic manuscripts volume is very mysterious, because it was apparently collated in the 20th century. It has a typed index in the front. It's not mentioned in 17th century sources. There is no sub-series as domestic manuscripts. These are mostly volatile items, mobile items, like paper sheets, documents, drafts, other things. So they have started to be curated evidently in the 20th century. And where they were before is a great query to answer as a researcher. I mean, there have been like some documents from the 17th century list boxes or chests for such documents, or like assign them some value, but do not keep them like along with the main books of the society. So I think they came to hold archival value in the 20th century, really, but in the 17th, the fact that they were preserved could have pointed to the fact that they were valued either as a record for the administration or methodically. It was a long answer, sorry, but now to the point of ignorance. It's also a brilliant point, and I think that first of all, the point that I was trying to make about the intended audience shows us that you do not know really who was supposed to perform these experiments. So if you give a very detailed instructions to follow for somebody, or just like give a general descriptions and assume somebody knows how to do this. And I have to say that I was ignorant myself when I approached this and thought, first of all, I assumed when I studied these sources that perhaps these detailed instructions are for laboratory assistants or something like this, for invisible technicians, as Stephen Shapin calls them. And then I thought, why I am entitled to thinking this way, meaning perhaps why do I assume that they would require more background, more detail? Why? Perhaps they wouldn't. Perhaps maybe the people that were supposed to supervise them were also supposed to get to know more. So I have no idea at this point whether the requests are addressed to the people, to their actual addresses, which are mostly fellows, aristocrats, or is it supposed to be addressed to their laboratory assistants, to the invisible technicians? Like people, for instance, a list for John Wilkins has this point that he is to supervise a dog skin cut off at his house, to have a dog skin cut off at his house, which shows that he didn't do this with his bare hands, but he was just like supposed to bring in the result. So one great point of ignorance that we have about this list is who actually carried out these requests, if people carried this out. There's a huge deal of unarticulated knowledge, of tacit knowledge behind those experiments. So the point is that we do not know who were the real addresses of those lists. And that's a big ignorance spot.
Thank you very much. I have also perhaps a question, Ewa, if I may. I'll try to be very brief. Among the other things, you mentioned also a list of questions for travelers based on the model question, what is to be inspected? And I'm just curious, I wonder to what extent this type of lists for travelers, were related to this category of desiderata or wish lists in the Royal Society Library, and to what extent these specific lists derived from a different tradition, that of the travelogues.
One thing to answer your question is to point out that somehow it's very interesting that sometimes the desiderata lists or wish lists, as Vera Keller points out, got mixed in between the lists of questions and answers and queries for travelers. So perhaps they were still being, like, I think it was still under consideration and debate how are those categories to be distinguished, or how you are supposed to actually develop them, or like what is the level of specificity desired, like so the very term of desiderata. So I think maybe the boundaries were more fluid than I tried to sketch there, but still for instance, like there's the point that perhaps links to my answer to Stefano earlier about who was supposed to answer those desiderata. So do you gain this knowledge in case of travelers, for instance, from local sources, so local people, for instance, or who performs the experiments? So I think what links them and what is not obvious from the sources and the way they are collected, preserved, archived today was who was the actual addressee providing answers to those questions, both in case of travelers and the lists that were supposed to be taken en route somewhere, and in cases of people carrying out the experiments. So I think that as genres, they could have been developed in tandem and then separate a little bit, maybe. Perhaps that's why they are archived differently in the Royal Society Library today. And they are connected by this unobvious point about who was supposed to answer the requests. With travelogues, I have to say that this is a blind spot for me, as speaking of ignorance. How could the desiderata, the questions to be asked for in travels, how could have they been derived from travelogues, or how they were somehow perhaps supplemented to learn more about what was mentioned in the travelogues. So I think that what I can answer right now is how they are similar and different in terms of their shape, formulation, and circulation. But with the travelogues, I have to look further into this. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I do not see any other hand. Okay, so in that case, thank you very much once again.
Oh, could I just follow up on your question?
Yes, just a short one, please. We are
Yes.
a little bit running of time, but yeah, we have still 5 to 10 minutes.
So I've looked at the travel questions, and one of the things that's an important source is Hans Sloane's voyage to Jamaica, which turns out to be this hugely Baconian text, which follows lots of the experiments in the Paraskive as well as the Silver Savarum. So that's a really good source for travel. But then you get lots and lots, hundreds of letters coming back to the Royal Society from Japan, from China, from the Philippines, from Peru, recipes or new drugs that are being found in native populations that come back to the Royal Society that are then experimented with at the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries. So there's a whole kind of ecosystem of information that's coming, especially medical information coming from the New World into the Royal Society. And then because Hans Sloane is president of the Royal College of Physicians, and he's the benefactor of the Chelsea Physic Garden, lots of these medical observations come to be experimented with in the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries.
Okay, thank you very much. Ewa, would you like to react?
Yes, exactly. There is this group of sources that I forgot about, and the source very similar to the one you have just mentioned. It's there are observations, instructions for observations for people, for instance, choosing to carry items back home from travels, addressed to Royal Society Fellows, etc. So how to pick, like these are instructions for collecting, for observing, and it's about it's very much like a kind of an instructive list. Is what is to be guarded, what kind of questions to ask of those items, or also like how to preserve them. They are usually, yes, it's also like another kind of a source, which is a kin source, I think, to all those questions, travels, these queries, these protocols for experiments. So indeed, there's a bigger family of sources, and thank you very much for coming for reminding us of that.
Okay, thank you very much once again, and I would like to ask you to applaud to our today's speaker, Ewa. Thank you.
Thank you for being here and for the brilliant questions. Now I have lots of food for thought after this seminar. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We will be meeting next week on Monday again, and our next speaker is Michal Choptiany. He will present his paper on the topic Reforming Calendar and World Chronology in the Early Modern Poland, Lithuania. So we are very much welcome. Thank you, and see you next week. Bye-bye.